Hello YouTube. Today we're going to work on a Citroen C2 and replace brakes. What you'll need is a good jack, also some wheel chocks or some big rocks, something you put on the tires, jack stand, 1, 2 is better, some latex gloves or work gloves of some sort, a drill with a wire brush is great, or a wire brush, something to clean off rusty stuff, some retaining screws for the new rotors, a ratchet with a 13mm, and a torx bit that's a T30 and a torx bit that is a T55. Without those you're not going to get the saddle off and you're not going to be able to do this job. Also what comes in handy is a work light. WD-40, always good. Also you're gonna need some brake cleaner to get the old brake dust off and clean your parts. I use a compression tool for the brake cylinder. You're gonna need some new brake pads, new rotors. If you have an impact gun, that's great. You don't need it though. It's just to get the tires off. Always good, some rags and tub or so where you can. First we're gonna open the reservoir for the brake fluid. Put some rags around it because some fluid might spill out of it. Then next you're gonna put some rocks under the wheels, or wheel chock if you have, so the car doesn't roll away. Place your jack. I really recommend that you spend some money on a good jack. You don't want to use the one that comes to the vehicle. That's for emergencies and really not anything to work with. It's just not safe. After you lift the car up, place a jack stand. This is just a little car. I'm just using one and the jack. But you know, depending on your situation, you may want to use 2. Next we're going to take the cap off the wheel, just with a screwdriver. There's a notch, pops right out. I'm using an impact wrench to loosen the bolts. You know, you can just use and there's our brake. Now, first we're gonna take the brake caliper off. It's 2 screws. It's 13mm metric. For the top one, because of the brake line, you might need a short extension just to kind of get around that. Bottom one, you don't need that. It's tight, but it's not super tight, so watch your knuckles as you apply pressure. I'm using a small extension to kind of turn this into a breaker bar to loosen that screw without having to apply too much force. There goes number 1 and number 2. Once you have them loose, you can just unscrew them by hand. And have a piece of wire ready, because once you lift the caliper off, you want to be able to let it hang like off the spring, because you don't want any stress on the brake line itself. And the caliper is pretty heavy, and especially if it just kind of dangles, it would put a lot of stress on the brake line, and that's an important piece. Also, you want to get it kind of out of the way. If you pull the caliper a little bit towards yourself, you'll compress the brake cylinder and then it comes off really easy. It's just floating on there. Alright, there you go. Now I'm gonna just put a piece of wire through one of the screw holes and then let it dangle there. Next we're going to take the brake saddle off. That's a T55 torx, and there's 2 of them. Again, I'm going to use my ratchet and with a little extension on it to just have a little bit more power there. Again, watch your knuckles, try not to slip off there. And there it goes. Alright. Yeah, once you have those out, it just lifts off. And you're almost halfway done. Alright, there we go. There are 2 retaining screws that hold the rotor in place. It's a T30 torx. It might be a T27, but I used a T30 and it worked fine, but I found some conflicting information on there. And those you're supposed to always use new screws. You know, I bought new ones, but the ones that were in there were still in pretty good shape. Now the rotor might be stuck and rusted on, so I'm going to use some WD-40 because it was not sliding off. Just a creep in there, and then you can use a hammer and tap a little bit from behind and it'll come off. If it's really rusted on, you know, just give it a couple good hits, tap there, and eventually it'll start moving. There it goes. Alright, now we're going to clean the surface area and we get it ready. This one's not that bad, but it's really difficult. Putting a little bit of Loctite blue on there, or liquid moly in this case, but a blue fastener, a Loctite type substance to keep the screws from coming out. There was nothing on it when I took it apart, so the previous person that worked on this car didn't do that, but I'm a big fan of securing those. The shiny new rotor. Just line up the holes. run new retaining screws in. It's again the T30. Now we're going to use some brake cleaner. Comes in a brake cleaner, it's like $3 or $4. And use a wire brush to get all the loose grime brake dust off there. And then when we get the rough stuff off, use a rag and more brake cleaner just to get the surface areas clean, so that there's nothing stuck in between. Alright, so that's clean. I'm going to put some Loctite blue on the bolts before we put that back together. It only fits on there one way, so you can't really mess that up. Again, T55, and that holds the saddle, so you want to have that on there pretty tight. Alright. Now the next thing, I'm going to compress the brake cylinder. As I'm doing that, I'm using a compression tool, but you can also use a clamp and a piece of wood or something. Just make sure you don't mess up the surface of the cylinder. So I'm going to use an old brake pad, put that on the cylinder, and then use the compression tool to press the cylinder all the way back. Otherwise it's not going to fit over the new rotor, and the new brake pads are much thicker too. Now as you do that, you will push fluid out of the reservoir. So keep an eye on that you don't want the fluid to spill all over the place, because it's a pretty nasty liquid. And as the fluid level goes up, you want to siphon some off. Like you can either use like a syringe or whatever you have available or so, but you want to a lot less brake fluid once you have the new brakes on. The advantage of doing it this way is that you're not going to have any air in the system. It stays all intact, and you don't have to use the bleeder screw. And I always found this way to be the easiest and most effective. My caliper was not that bad, so I cleaned it a little bit, but for the most part it was already good to go. Now this is important. You're going to need some brake service grease. It goes on the outside of the brake pads, obviously not on the braking surface. You want to smush that around a little bit. That's what's going to keep your brakes from not squealing. And nothing is more annoying than you spend all afternoon doing new brakes, then you start driving off and they squeal. So that is important. Those little packs, they sell them at the car parts stores. Sometimes they come with the brake pads, but they're like $1 or so, but definitely worth it. Now on the Citroen, both brake pads are identical, so super easy, you can't mess that up. Put one on the front, one on the back, they just slide right back in onto those clips that are on the brake saddle. Ratchet with a 13mm metric. You're almost done. You want those tight, but you don't want to over tighten them. Alright, that looks good. Check and see if you have some play. See if everything is in place properly. That looks good. Alright, now we can close the reservoir. Remove those rags, I didn't need them. And now we're going to put the wheel back on. Now before you the car off the lift or take it off your jack and lower the jack, make sure there's nothing underneath. That's a rookie mistake, but you want to make sure that your jack stand is out, you don't have any tools under there, and then you are good to go. I hope this was helpful. I've done this kind of work many times, but I'm not a professional mechanic. But this is how I learned how to do this, and I hope I was able to help you out a little bit.